Iran has apologized to its neighbors for the recent days of missiles and drones, but with a condition, vowing that there will be no further attacks unless the territories of these countries in the Gulf are used for attacks on Iran. Trump is claiming credit for this apology and threatening Iran that even bigger hits are coming. As oil prices surge, global trade is impacted, the supply chain could be broken, global aviation has been hit. Is this Trump's biggest blunder yet? And can anybody pull him back from the brink? These were the images that were seen over the Dubai skyline earlier today as a drone from Iran landed somewhere near the airport, suspending operations for a few hours. Those operations have since resumed. But it's been another day of strife in what we call West Asia and the Americans call the Middle East. Trump is threatening Iran with bigger hits in the days to come. These are some of the images coming out of the region in the last few hours. This, even as Iran is apologizing to its neighbors in the Gulf for the recent days that have seen the skies of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Bahrain light up with interceptions of missiles and drones, some of which have also hit targets. Did Trump entirely miscalculate Iran? Did he think Iran was like Venezuela? And now that he knows that Iran is not Venezuela and will certainly not go down without a fight, now that he has a terrible jobs report, bad headlines from the Epstein files, and rising oil prices, why is he still going ahead? To try and make sense of what is happening in the world today, this at a time when the Americans are talking of a so-called waiver for India on the purchase of Russian oil. And by the way, India has said today that oil supplies from Russia are going to be increased and could go up to 40% of India's supplies. Let me introduce three very distinguished experts as we try and make sense of the crazy times we live in. I want to welcome veteran diplomat Ambassador Arun Singh to the program with special expertise here, having been envoy to both Israel and the United States of America. Welcome, Ambassador Singh.
I
Also
don't
joining
hear
me,
anybody. Is that
uh,
right?
we can hear you, sir, but give us a second. We'll disconnect you and we'll connect you again. If we can just ask Professor Hushang to disconnect. I want to welcome Bobby Ghosh to the program. Bobby Ghosh is a friend and a colleague. He has spent years covering the countries in the Middle East and the conflict within the Middle East. And thank you, Bobby. And I was going to introduce Hushang Amir Ahmadi, but for some reason he can't hear us, so we'll have him up when we can. Let me get you, Ambassador Arun Singh, if I may start with you. What do you make of Iran's very interesting apology led by the president himself to neighboring countries? I think it's quite an interesting, I might even argue, very smart move, because what it's doing is it's kind of creating a pressure on all of these countries to basically tell the Americans, stop using us for attacks on Iran. That's the most recent development we have, and I want your response to it.
So I think seeing the manner in which the Iranians responded in the beginning, I think they probably felt that the only way they could generate some pressure on the US and Israel was by attacking the US presence in the Gulf. And of course, it went beyond just the US presence. There were attacks on facilities that were not necessarily housing the US military. And you saw that in various countries in the Gulf. And I think the message was that if the US sustains its presence, its attacks on Iran, Iran will try and make it difficult for US to operate in the broader Middle East. And the governments there who've been hosting military presence should also be concerned about what the US is doing. Now, having made that message and whatever they had done, one can make the argument that in the next phase of the conflict, and given the kind of supplies that Iran may have to sustain for a longer period, it may make sense for them to hold back on the attacks on its neighbors. Because there's growing anger among the neighbors. There have been warnings coming from them. You saw that there was a meeting between the Saudi leadership and the Pakistan Army chief, where they recalled the recent defense cooperation agreement that was signed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So I think Iran may have felt that there was a very severe negative reaction developing in the neighborhood. And in the next phase, it made sense for them to scale that down. And of course, as you said, they made the marker that these countries should prevent the US from attacking Iran from the bases that are there. Now, the way the US has been operating, they're not listening to anyone. They're doing what they want from where they want, and therefore, whether US is able to restrain itself, if it doesn't restrain, how does Iran respond? So I think this is a fast-moving situation, and let's just see how it keeps evolving.
Yeah. Bobby, let me bring you in there. Iran, as the ambassador said, is clearly hoping that these countries in the Gulf will now weigh in on the Americans to not use bases in their territories to attack Iran. But argue differently, the only leverage Iran has is actually this asymmetric warfare, is actually to target these installations as it has been doing in the Gulf countries, because militarily it cannot take on either Israel or the United States of America. If Iran indeed does keep its promise to not target, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the Saudis even, where does that leave the future of the cards they may have left to play on the table, Bobby?
Well, I think those cards only work when you have a conventional leadership on the opposite side. When you're facing somebody like Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, those cards don't really work. And I think what we are seeing now is an acknowledgement of that. I think, yes, the Iranians attacked these GCC countries. I don't believe for a moment that this apology that, the central leadership was not aware, that is nonsense. This was deliberate. But they discovered that it didn't work. In fact, it may have had the opposite effect, where the Gulf countries, which, let's remind ourselves, in the lead up to this conflict, the Gulf countries had been at some pains to communicate to Iran and to the world that, look, we're not participating in this. We've told the Americans over and over again, you can't use our bases. This is happening over our objections. Despite that, Iran attacked targets in those countries. And that instead of frightening those countries and making those countries pick up the phone and call Donald Trump and say, "Oh, please stop doing this," they got pretty mad, and their anger was targeted much more at Iran than at the Americans. At least if you go by public pronouncements. And I think what we are seeing now is an acknowledgement from the Iranian leadership that they made a terrible miscalculation, and they're now trying to fix it. The Gulf leadership is already well aware that even if they were to pick up the phone and call Donald Trump and say, this is hurting our interests, please stop doing this, Donald Trump's not going to listen. Donald Trump, works to his own calculations, which are mysterious and often seem irrational to those of us outside. He's not the sort of person to be persuaded by this kind of pleas, if indeed there would be such pleas. So the Iranians have messed up, and this is their acknowledgement that we screwed up. We've now got not just the Americans and the Israelis, but we've also got all of our neighbors mad at us, and we need to fix this.
But Bobby, if I can ask you, if you think that the Iran targeting of the GCC countries was in fact a mistake, then in that case, where does Iran go from here? Because Iran can't militarily take on either the United States or Israel. Iran could only draw the world's attention and create a kind of global environment where countries were horrified by what was happening and were probably imploring the Americans to somehow stop this war because they drew the Gulf countries in. So, if you're saying that was a mistake, what other cards does Iran have left to play?
Well, we've seen how this particular regime in Iran operates. They have many asymmetric weapons at their hands. They've got their proxies outside of Iran, although many of these proxies are greatly wounded. They're still, some of them are still quite active, the Houthis being the most striking example. Hezbollah has joined in the fighting to disastrous consequences for Lebanon, I might add, but Iran still has that card to play. They have terrorist groups all over the world. They are capable of launching terrorist attacks far, far from Iran. We've seen that happen in places as far away as Buenos Aires and Bangkok. And remember, not so long ago, even in New Delhi, there was an attempt to take out a target there. So, and right here in New York City, there was an attempt to assassinate an Iranian-American citizen. So Iran does have other cards to play. But I don't think those cards, again, all of this works when you're dealing with somebody in the White House who behaves like a normal, rational political actor. They are now facing the great unknown. All of their traditional, the traditional weapons that they have at their hands, and that includes these asymmetric weapons, don't really work with somebody who views the world the way that Donald Trump does. And I think in the days ahead, we'll see a greater acknowledgement and acceptance of that.
Okay, I'm just wondering, Professor Hushang, are you able to hear me now? Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me? Hushang Amir Ahmadi, are you able to hear me? All right, I think there's some problem with his network. With apologies to him, we'll keep the conversation going amongst ourselves. Ambassador Arun Singh, if Bobby's argument is true, that Iran basically screwed up in targeting the Gulf countries, probably even alienated them, and you've got this irrational entity called Donald Trump in the White House, what are we looking at in the next few weeks or months even? And I want to bring in an Indian perspective here. Two things. One, we now know that India has given refuge to an Iran warship in Kochi. And we also know now that the Indian Navy did respond to a distress call before the IRIS Dina was sunk by a US submarine. Intriguingly, this communication on both these things came very late. So for a whole day, it was looking like the ship was sunk and the Sri Lankans jumped in and we didn't. We now know we tried to supplement that rescue effort. But it's created a kind of level of disquiet at American unilateralism. This is in the Indian Ocean region. This is a region where we have always sought a larger role for ourselves. How concerned are you at what happened with the Iranian warship?
No, I'm certainly concerned because it reflects more how US is operating at the moment. And Bobby himself said that we are dealing with a completely different kind of leadership where the norms, rules that as normally we understood are not being applied at the moment. And certainly one would have expected that these vessels were far away from the conflict zone. They have participated in exercises, and could have been different ways of dealing with that, and just wanting them to stay away from the conflict zone, and that would have been the normal course. But here things are being handled differently. But what worries me, partly, of course, we have to see how Iran responds. But what worries me is that irrationality or a different kind of leader that Bobby spoke about doesn't necessarily mean success. It can mean a bit of mayhem, it can mean destruction, but that doesn't mean success. US didn't succeed in Iraq in 2003 in terms of regime change. US didn't succeed in Libya in 2011. And as everybody has pointed out, in Afghanistan, after 20 years of effort, US replaced Taliban and then brought them back. I have also dealt with the India-Iran relationship for some time in the past. And I can tell you the Iranian institutional structure, whether we like it or not, has its challenges, is a fairly enduring structure in many ways. There are layers and layers of overlapping layers of governance, institutions. And I'm not saying that there's a challenge, the oppression and whatever that goes with it. But their capacity to survive any kind of onslaught is very, very strong. And then if you remember, in the Iran-Iraq war, went on for 8 years. And at that time also, US had sponsored an opposition group called the MEK. And eventually they went nowhere. And so again, US, from all reports, is trying to encourage a group of Kurds to do some activity on the ground in the northwestern part of Iran. Now, so these activities and certainly will generate more violence, but one doesn't see at the moment any clear indication that US has a clear objective, a clear game plan. At the moment, the whole objective seems to be to cause damage and destruction.
I have a couple of questions on how we should be responding and how we have responded. But before that, Bobby, Russia. So a couple of things on Russia. It is... I mean, for lack of a better word, it's actually hilarious or absurd. Absurd is the better word. That Trump weaponized these tariffs, at least vis-a-vis India, in part because of the purchase of Russian oil. And now here we are, where the US is talking about quote-unquote permissions and waivers. The government, by the way, has just released an official statement here saying that India is going to be increasing its supplies of oil from Russia. And Russia could now be supplying 40% of India's oil needs, right? So this is where we are. This is it's sort of a bizarre, absurd sort of turning point. The second is to read this with the fact that we now know of Russian backing and help to Iran. Bobby, how's this being sort of looked at in the US?
Well, those who are paying close attention, and I should add that not a lot of people are paying close attention to the India aspect of this here in the US, but those who are paying attention notice the incongruity of those two things. That on the one hand, first of all, by the way, this benefits Russia in all kinds of ways. So the United States attacks Iran, oil prices go up, Russia benefits. Then the United States says, then Iran counterattacks to Gulf countries, oil prices go up even more. Russia benefits some more. And now the United States says it's okay for India to buy more Russian oil, and Russia benefits more. Meanwhile, Russians are giving the Iranians targets and targeting information. So this is just impossibly irrational and absurd, but not that strange from this administration. What's happened here is that it's clear that in this war, Trump is making things up as he goes along. There's not an effort to look at what might come in the next step, never mind 2-3 steps ahead. This is a response to the realization that A, this war is going to last for a while, B, oil prices are going to shoot up. They're already in the 90s today. They will go up to 3 figures, maybe even before this conversation is over. That's what's happening. And the United States needs to take some pressure off of international oil prices. And they will do almost anything they can. And this is an attempt to do that. I don't think it will work, but this is an attempt to do that. Like I said, we're dealing with irrational actors here. Now, I should sort of add that there are irrational actors on the other side as well. The Iranian regime has been irrational from the get-go. The whole fundamental premise of the Iranian regime is irrational. And when pushed to a corner, they've historically acted in wild and unpredictable ways. And we'll see more of this happen rather than less. And so I think, the oil prices will continue to go up. The White House has continued to trash around to find some solution. The big beneficiaries will be Russia, because oil prices going up means that they benefit. And yes, India will get a little bit of a break on the oil side for now, but India has many other problems emanating from the war that it has to deal with. The Russians will presumably want to charge a little more for the oil than they have been from India. It may still be lower than the international market prices, but it will be more than they had previously.
Yeah.
So the bill will be larger for India. And then, of course, for India, the biggest question is 10 million Indians in a war zone. What do you do about that?
Yeah, and we'll come to that. I'm going to have a last bash at seeing if Hushang Amir Ahmadi is able to hear me. Are you able to hear me, Professor Hushang? Are you at all able to hear me? Okay, we are absolutely not able to communicate with him for some reason today. Apologies for that. Ambassador Arun Singh, if I may come to you on the question of not just the consequences for India, but there's been a lot of debate over India's handling of this. And we did finally see a statement. We're having a bad tech day. We did finally see a statement, Bobby, I'll take that to you, from Prime Minister Modi, a guarded statement saying military conflicts don't lead to any solution. We also saw the Foreign Secretary signing the condolence book. That was the first time that India actually condoled the killing or the death rather of Ali Khamenei. How do you see India's response? Again, there are no easy answers here because, as you said, there are 10 million Indians in the Gulf. There was also a lot of debate around Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel just on the eve of these strikes. Israel has now gone on record to say that Modi was not informed of these strikes. We have that statement on record. Bobby, if you want to come in, and then Ambassador Singh.
Well, it is a day late and many dollars short for India to now be expressing condolences for Khamenei's death. I don't think there's any doubt in the minds of people paying attention where India stands in this. It is uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable position to be in. But the fact is that India has put itself in one side of this argument and is now trying to find its way back to the center. Whether that is persuasive, I doubt it very much. I don't think the Iranian regime is going to be mollified by India signing a condolence book for Khamenei. I think the Iranians are assuming that India is a hostile party, or at least not a neutral party in this. And that's something that the other Arab states will be paying close attention to. At the end of the day, in the final calculus with the Arab states, it might not matter. I think there has been generally, when I speak with Arab diplomats and particularly in the GCC countries, there is a shrug about India's position vis-a-vis Israel. There's an acknowledgement that India has drawn close to Israel, that India is, even if it's not a participant in these kinds of operations, that India's sympathies lie on one side. And they seem to be perfectly fine. The Arab states seem to be fine with that. By the way, they've also built relationships with Israel. They acknowledge that this kind of transactional, or if you like, realpolitik, is the nature of the world we live in now. The old idea is that you have to take one ideological side and then stick to that side no matter what.
Yeah.
Nobody does that anymore. Nobody's expecting India to do that.
Yeah, let me give you the last. Word. I was hoping that Ambassador Arun Singh could get a word in, but clearly both of our other guests are having bad technology days. You said that the president is clearly not rational, and that's a polite way of putting it. And you said the Iranians are not rational either. Now, given these two irrational entities, the fact is that their confrontation doesn't leave large parts of the world unscathed. There are consequences for everybody here, from oil prices to aviation to trade to the global economy. Do you believe that there is anything that will pull Trump back from the brink, Bob?
I think with Trump, it's a question of how much there are several things. One is how much ammunition he has left. These long-range missiles that the United States is using, there's a limited supply of those, and at some point there will be a risk of those running out. The fact that they're obliged to move missile batteries from places like South Korea is not reassuring. So that may impose a certain limitation. The other thing that may impose limitations is if the war is prolonged and Iran is able to, heaven forbid, but if Iran is able to kill American citizens or impose a sort of conduct a terrorist attack that shakes up the calculus in Washington. These are the only two things. But again, these things would work with they would have worked with a Biden, with an Obama, with a George Bush senior or junior. These were people whose behavior was predictable based on certain understandings of the world. Whether or not we agreed with those understandings, they were predictable, and they had a certain rational argument underneath. With the Trump administration, that does not seem to be the case. So I really hesitate to make any kind of predictions about what might stop Donald Trump. The only safe thing to say is Donald Trump will stop Donald Trump, nothing else.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't seem to be in a mood to stop himself right now. Ambassador Singh, we keep losing you. So while we have you here, if you want to just a quick word on the consequences for India. Bobby was saying that India had placed itself on one side of this argument and is now trying to move itself to the center. You've seen the heat and debate this is generated at home. So just a closing comment to you on that.
So first, of course, just to add to Bobby's comment, I think something that might stop Donald Trump is if there's a negative reaction in the US economy, and negative reaction as a result of that on his base, because they're going in for elections in November, the midterm elections, and those will be very consequential for the second phase of the Trump administration. So if something happens there, Trump will have to take a pause because his base doesn't want a prolonged war. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Second, clearly, as Bobby also indicated and you mentioned, there has been a perception that at least in the initial phase, the government of India, for whatever reason, took a certain stance, which was seen as somewhat supportive of US and Israeli concerns and not as mindful of Iran's concerns. Whatever that may have been the calculations, obviously the Iranians will see it in a certain way. And we must keep in mind that Iran is an important partner for us, aside from certain composition of our own population, for whatever we want to do in Afghanistan. Because there is no way we can reach Afghanistan except through Iran. And so that's something for us. And in the past, before the US administration sanctions had started coming in, Iran had been a very important energy partner for the US. So
Yeah.
I think there has been a criticism on that account, and that US
I
has
mean,
been treating
do
India.
you think in retrospect, the decision by India to stop buying oil from Iran at the behest of the Americans was a mistake?
We couldn't have done anything else at that time. There was a cost
Yeah.
benefit analysis. If you did that, you'd be sanctioned. If companies did cost benefit analysis, they needed to buy equipment in the US, they needed to raise capital in the
Yeah.
US, all that would have been blocked. So purely on cost benefit. And certainly at the moment, there's huge cost for India. I mean, aside from energy prices, concern about Indians in the Gulf, you're seeing the problem related to fertilizer.
Yeah.
Problem related to shortage of gas, supplies to some of our industry could be curtailed. So there is a huge challenge. There is a tremendous negative impact that we'll have to deal with. I mean, we've tried to build a buffer and whatever. And then the uncertainty it creates for the stock market, for the rupee. So all that is playing out. And so
And
one would hope.
in this context, should we be conveying some sort of displeasure to the Americans, especially over the sinking of the ship so close to our shores? Or do you believe that that is not the relationship that we have right now?
Well, more important, when we had the conflict with Pakistan in May, what the US did, jumped up and down and saying that let's have a ceasefire. So, given that, we should tell the US that what you preach about ending conflict and moving towards ceasefire is something you need to practice. Now, this is causing problems for the entire region. It's causing problems for a lot of people. And we don't believe, at least as analysts and others, that US is going to achieve its objective. It can project that it has, caused certain amount of damage, destruction, which is not going to achieve its objective. So, what is the cost worth it? That's something that US
Yeah.
leaders and the political class has to figure out for themselves.
Bobby, very quickly before we close, to Ambassador Arun Singh's point that it's the economy, stupid. That's always been the centerpiece of American politics, and they say that Trump doesn't understand anything, but he understands. He understands that, right? Is there any rumblings? Are there? I know that there've been the sort of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Megyn Kelly who said, "Why are we fighting Israel's war?" But beyond these two, are there any rumblings from within Trump's own base? The jobs report is not good. The Epstein headlines, which he probably hoped would go away, are not good. Is there any sign that, I mean, obviously, overtly, there's no sign, but are there any rumblings from within?
Wait, there are different benchmarks. When gas goes above it, gasoline goes above $4, that hasn't happened yet. When it goes above $5, there are different pressure tests on the American public opinion that are well established. We'll see when we get to those places. For the moment, there are rumblings, but Trump is also preparing his base in a sense. He started out by saying, "Oh, this will be over soon." Now his people are communicating, "Oh, it may take some weeks, it may take some months." He's also said, "You know what? Prices may go up. That's what happens in a war." He said that people die, American soldiers may die. He's being quite open about. It's worth noting one thing about Trump. Whatever we think about his behavior and the logic that he applies, if that's the correct word, Trump is a leader. He leads his base, and his base tends to follow him. Most of the so-called leadership of the political in liberal democracies around the world are actually followers. They look at polls. They say, "This is what our followers want, and therefore we will tailor our policies and our speeches to what our followers want." Trump is quite different. Trump says, "I want to go in that direction." When he arrives at that place, taking his followers with him, he's perfectly capable. He's done this over and over again, saying, "You know what? I've changed my mind. I want to go in that direction." And his base follows him. That is something that is often not noticed or overlooked by analysts. This guy actually is capable of leading these people. Now we can say it's a Pied Piper and he's leading them to their doom, and I may go along with some of that, but he actually does it, and he has done it over and over again. He has promised his people something, and he's changed his mind, and his people have still stuck with him so far. When oil hits $4, will they still do it? When oil hits $5, will they still do it? We'll cross that bridge when we come there.
Well, 4 weeks or anything longer than that is frankly a doomsday scenario for the global economy. There's no two ways about it. It has severe consequences for us in India. Americans have made many regime change mistakes that have always landed up in disaster, but this one has consequences for many more countries outside of America and the country that they're trying to intervene in. And that's why this is such colossal news, such sobering news for us here in India as well. Thank you very much, Bobby Ghosh, Ambassador Arun Singh. Appreciate your time. Learned a lot from both of you. Thank you. And to our audience, take care. Have a great weekend. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.